I've had nothing but bad luck since the day I saw that cat at my door. So I came into you, sweet lady, answering your mystical call. Crystal ball on the table, showing the future, the past. Same cat with them evil eyes, and I knew it was a spell she cast. Hello everyone, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. And in my humble opinion, Weapons writer, director, and former Whitest Kids You Know creator Zach Krieger's highly anticipated sophomore follow-up to his 2022 horror hit Barbarian is a slick, technically astute, densely conceived, oftentimes downright evocative when it isn't ecstatically funny, black comic horror thrill ride. It's also just kind of a wash, just a little bit, doing the just a little bit dance. If you're a regular attender of the movie theater, and especially if you're a horror buff, you'll have been no stranger to the publicity campaign for Weapons, which was certainly a creative masterclass in itself. The tagline for the film was practically a log line to a Hollywood screenplay. At 2:17 a.m., every child from Mrs. Gandy's class woke up, got out of bed, went downstairs, opened the front door, and walked into the dark, and they never came back. Now, those of us going into this who have memory enough for the ad campaign for Barbarian itself, Krieger's previous film, without spoiling it for anybody who hadn't caught up with Barbarian. By the way, watch Barbarian, it's fun and gives you the heebie-jeebies. You got memory enough for Barbarian, you have memory for its own ad campaign, and how that, again, perfectly played into the theatrical experience itself. The realization when it hits in the movie that the trailer basically only included elements from, like, the first half hour or so of this thing, and here comes Justin Long. Oh boy, we're through the looking glass now here, people. Weapons has a similar Justin Long moment, as it were. I think you can honestly really mark the first major tilt in the story to that Justin Long cameo performance. And the story? Didn't I just tell you? It's the log line, the high-concept log line. At 2:17 a.m., every child from Ms. Gandy's class woke up, got out of bed, went downstairs, opened the front door, and walked into the dark, and they never came back. Krieger is definitely one of that elevated horror camp, so-called, and especially part of that special quarter of the elevated horror trend where you had established writers and directors and performers of TV and then film pivoting from comedy into a more subcultural genre of horror, and especially of international horror. I never saw The Whitest Kids You Know. I also never saw Key and Peele before having seen all three of the high-concept, cryptically structured and arranged sci-fi horror flicks that Jordan Peele had made. And as far as I'm concerned, the influence of Krieger's contemporary comedian turned auteur of a kind of 21st century new Hollywood popular cinema based in established genres is undeniable. Though Krieger's specific style may pull from its own grab bag of influences, I don't think there's any arguing that these two don't share in a very specific vernacular in terms of how they approach the structuring of a film, and especially in the almost puzzle-like fascination they seem to share in terms of burying the lead of where a story is going, not just in advertising, but in spooling along the suspense in the film itself, where, and you very much see this with Weapons, that high-concept log line you see on the poster and is used to introduce the movie in the form of narration over black screen, it's really just the key to unlock what turns out to be a rather chronologically unconventional horror story. Weapons jumps from character study to character study, starting with Ms. Justine Gandy herself, that being the incomparable Julia Gardner as the elementary school teacher whose class of small children, all but one, disappears into the night, who all while fending off the irrational, almost witch panic-styled anger of this small town against her, decides to basically go on her own uncouth adult Nancy Nancy Drew-esque mystery tour to find the children and clear her name. But then Krieger, at a dramatically critical moment for Justine, will jump to Josh Brolin as Archer, the father of one of these missing children, and studies his own drive to find out what happened to his son and his particular malice towards Justine, and his own attempts to chase down the source of his son's disappearance. And at a dramatically critical moment, that pattern repeats about 4 more times, the last one wrapping up the loose ends in a pattern not unsimilar to Barbarian, but obviously a lot more ambitiously in this case. Because the ways in which these individual character studies will intersect will show the same scene from different third-person perspectives that, because of small but noticeable differences, not just in how the scenes are entered, where they end, but the perspectives from where the camera looks and observes, the way it's edited, not just those things, but specific differences in performances and specific line readings by actors that are emphasized. Krieger almost seems to be playing in the terrain of a kind of Rashomon-styled narrative where even within the framing of the story as something that is being narrated to us from that voice at the beginning, the different subjectivities of the story diverge even in terms of basic perception of events and how things are said and what certain details signify to the different characters. Again, not unlike Peele, honestly, there's a kind of showy ingenuousness to Krieger's movies, almost like you can see him flexing to a popular audience his downright intellectual finesse in how you can take the basic building blocks of a high concept, sharply executed genre story in its own right, and even tease them out in small ways beyond expectations, even more so that you never quite lose track of the fact that there is an authorial voice here, and that authorial voice, though it's not literally Krieger speaking, that voice itself is performing in as much as the actors, the entire cast are performing, even right down to the execution of basic jump scares. There's this glee that emanates from Krieger's direction, how he's able to make certain scenes, even several very obviously framed dream sequences, which can normally be such a tiresome cliche of fantasy and supernatural stories, and string you along for, at times, even just a moment longer than you expect to be, and then hitting you with an image, even if it's not necessarily the most viscerally shocking, is downright unsettling. Only to be counterbalanced by this similarly gleeful black comic tone, with several of these moments being capped off with a character acting not deeply traumatized or disturbed, but just like frustrated or annoyed, as if even the dreams in these movies, at least at first, sandbag these characters as something relatable and how absurd it is, and not really making sense that means anything to them in the moment, because instead of it portending something for them, it almost seems like the characters react like we react, still trying to put the puzzle pieces of this unfolding story together. There's this sort of really good connection between how the audience experiences dramatic irony in a movie like Krieger or Peele makes the characters experience that dramatic irony on their own terms. The performances broadly in Weapons are really quite impressive, because in that balance that Krieger is striking between the atmospheric and dreadful and then the otherwise almost laughably absurd, or at least foiblish in the way that characters behave, their various self-destructive or unflattering traits. It clearly gives all these actors something rather meaty to work with, because Krieger structures his film effectively around a series of vignettes in which we fully inhabit the space of that character and follow them, and not necessarily the story that frames all that action and that character study. Not that the story is unimportant by any means, but I don't think it's unfair to say that Krieger kind of luxuriates in staying with characters as he crafts them just long enough for there to be gratuitous moments, or maybe gratuitous isn't the right word so much as we get to observe moments with characters that are frivolous, and sometimes even as they intersect with other characters' stories, seem to be dead ends that don't go anywhere consequential necessarily directly, but do more in terms of making weapons less about the specific moment in which the puzzle pieces are starting to be put together for you and the bigger picture begins to take shape, with still a lot of it being put in your mind's eye and more about the specific ways in which all of these different characters can have their own, not just scary or disturbing, but downright bizarre and strange interactions with this greater Stephen King-esque occult mystery behind the high concept instigation of it, that log line. It's a very smartly crafted movie. But do you ever think there's such a thing as a movie being too smartly crafted for its own good? I don't mind a puzzle movie, I really don't, but at a certain point, I do feel this tension from just how stylized Krieger's filmmaking is, and how hollow even those character studies sometimes feel as an exercise in technical craftsmanship, in a style that calls attention to forms unto themselves, but don't really necessarily hit me on an emotional level, besides the sort of intrigue and nervousness and cathartic shivers and jolts and laughter that I can oftentimes get from films that are no less technically impressive, at least in terms of their cinematography and even depth of character writing and performances, but honestly a lot less cryptic, which is to say convoluted and even obscurantist to a degree, and therefore not having to leave me feel beleaguered when push comes to shove and you finally have to start making this movie about a movie about a. Again, I don't have an aversion to puzzle movies, and look, I'm a William Castle stan. I love a modern-day fantasy or sci-fi or horror movie that can just play in that terrain of the cinema of attractions, of the horror film as a spook ride, even if this specific track takes a few more twists and turns and makes the execution of the story just as much part of the self-aware thrills and chills and spills. But at least with something like Nope, and I'm definitely biased here, but the moment I put two and two together that this wasn't a movie about aliens, but a movie about one big alien monster, that it was a giant monster movie, I was like, fist pumping, let's f***ing go. That's something I haven't seen in a while. We're going old school, cheap B-movie monster on an A-picture budget. Let's go. I get that Krieger isn't working with the same ambition of scale, but what are we doing here? Bro, I can get that in Paranormal Activity. What are you doing? We have at home. Night Swim is a movie about a pool that eats people, and it's one of the best shot and written and acted horror movies of the 21st century. And it's also, just because of what it's about, one of the best cinema of attractions horror movies we've had since found footage movies jumped off. That's what I mean by something like Weapons, just even with its title, just feeling almost portentous in what it's about, and I'm sorry, what it's about is. And do you even care about witches as much as the Night Swim guys clearly showed they really gave a shit about making you give a shit about being not just scared, but like fucked up and mad at this goddamn fucking pool? You leave those kids alone! I didn't feel much from Weapons as a film other than being impressed. And I'm not going to movies to just be impressed. Krieger is a technical wizard, but there's no calculated, finely executed moment of screen spectacle that's going to make me think, when we're finally at the moment where the story is about, that if I get the feeling that this thing could be an alien parasite, or like a body snatcher, or like a vampire, or a mummy even, if I get the feeling that this puzzle has come together in a way that I'm still mainly looking at a puzzle taking shape, and not even a movie where, say, serve a rather specific, evocative purpose to what makes it disturbing or horrific, and aren't coming off as a kind of phoned-in placeholder for subtext that is, frankly now, especially since the so-called elevated horror wave, programmatic of this sort of trend in sort of middle-brow art house crossover genre cinema, where the subtext to the spectacle is just part of the puzzle of the spectacle. It's all to accentuate forms and the deft technical craftsmanship of those forms, but not necessarily what those forms can mean to an audience member. Not in a armchair intellectual sense, but in a deeply felt interior and emotional resonance with that spectacle. I see so many responses to this film being about how, well, this is about deeply buried traumas. And if it is, then it's clearly a pale imitation of Skinamarink. And if I may, I don't think it is. I think it's a movie about a I just think it takes a long, convoluted time that drags because these various vignettes, because of how frequently so many of them are cycled through over the course of this hour and 45-minute movie, as the pattern of these character study episodes repeats, it actually kind of contributes to this sense of drag as you have to keep resettling into a new vantage point of the narrative. I think this is a technically well-executed movie about a that becomes a lot less impressive when viewed in the context of just beating around the bush a lot on its way to being a movie about a and if this is an attempt to be a movie about urban legends and buried trauma and social allegory, I happen to think Weapons is a hot new example in those things being played out cliches in their own right too, and frankly maybe even be a smokescreen for, like, yeah, a movie that, once it becomes more and more clear that it's a movie about a kooky becomes substantially less interesting, gradually starts to lose the impressive hold that Krieger can wield from this undeniable ingeniousness he has in playing with the technicals of a spooky story. I will never begrudge a filmmaker for trying to be like, why don't we try doing a pat story in a non-pat way, whatever that means. But I'm sorry, if this is a movie about the unalloyed quirkiness of people against the backdrop of horrific tragedy, y'all just watch Eric LaRue. If Weapons really did resonate with you, I'm not sure how, but I hope Eric LaRue fucks you up and puts you all in your feels even harder. I think it's a funnier movie as well. Weapons is alright. Decent sophomore showing for Krieger. I liked small touches and was impressed by the overall execution, but just as an emotional experience of a work of film art that I hope to, in some sense, resonate with me beyond being impressed by the formal execution of that art itself, I gotta give it a fair 3 out of 5. With that, I'm going to be taking off. Thank you all so much for sticking through this whole video, and please don't be a stranger to shouting out in the comments, what did I get right? What did I get wrong? I imagine there's a lot of people who are going to be telling me what I got wrong, and I hope you do. And then please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.